Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. We've done a bunch of speculation about Boba Fett recently and what his role will be in the Mandalorian TV show. Some people have taken issue with the fact that we have called him a Mandalorian. Like with a lot of characters in Star Wars, there's disagreement amongst fans about the background information of Boba Fett. Which is why today we'll be looking at Boba Fett's background and whether he actually is a Mandalorian or not. We'll look at both sides. First, let's look at why Boba Fett is not a Mandalorian. When Episode 2 Attack of the Clones came out, George Lucas introduced a new character by the name of Jango Fett. He was supposed to be the father of one of the most beloved but underutilized characters from the original trilogy, Boba Fett. George Lucas described Jango Fett as a Mandalorian bounty hunter, and we learned that Boba Fett is his son and identical clone. Lucas goes on to say that although Boba Fett has basically learned a lot from his father about how to wear Mandalorian armor and how to fight like a Mandalorian, Jango hasn't really passed down a lot of the Mandalorian cultural values. More importantly, Boba Fett is a clone and he's raised around clones, so he doesn't really have a close connection to Mandalorian culture, especially after his father's head is disconnected from his body. While Lucas is no longer a part of the equation of who gets to decide what happens with Disney, Dave Filoni still is, and he's considered one of George Lucas's most important proteges. Jon Favreau might be in charge of the larger production aspects of The Mandalorian, but Dave Filoni is an encyclopedia of Star Wars knowledge and perhaps the individual Lucas trusted the most to continue telling his story. And so if George Lucas stated that he doesn't think Boba Fett is a Mandalorian, then most likely Dave Filoni will also follow along with that kind of idea. Clearly, Jon Favreau respects Filoni's input, and he's also stated that the Mandalorian, aka Din Djarin, is more of a traditional Mandalorian, perhaps indicating that Boba Fett was not. If we look at Jango Fett, his father, in both canon and legends, we see an individual who is very mercenary in nature, an attitude that is definitely also reflected in his son Boba Fett in the original trilogy. We didn't really know much about Boba Fett when we first saw him in the original trilogy. We just knew that he was willing to work for Vader and the Empire and that he liked to disintegrate people. Jango Fett was also a pretty no-nonsense type of mercenary, especially later in his life when he volunteers his sperm to create the Clone Army for a massive sum of money. Now in the Clone Wars series headed by Dave Filoni and George Lucas, we see Prime Minister Almec, one of the new Mandalorians, talk about Jango Fett. He says the following.
Jango Fett was a common bounty hunter. How he acquired that armor is beyond me.
Now, this is a quote commonly used by people who believe that Boba Fett is not a Mandalorian because this quote questions the legitimacy of Jango Fett, his father. Now, it's also a pretty loaded quote because it is from an individual who's in the new Mandalorian faction, which we will talk a little bit more about later, but that's a good transition to the why Boba Fett is a Mandalorian segment of this video. So, Prime Minister Almec of the new Mandalorian is a part of a pacifist government that has completely rejected the traditional Mandalorian way of life. To some Mando, like Death Watch, the argument would be that the new Mandalorians are no longer actually Mandalorians. You see, the term Mandalorian itself is very divisive. I mean, there have been civil wars within this cultural group. There have been different definitions, different types, different factions. It's a very confusing term. Because Mandalorians aren't really a typical ethnicity. By definition, people who belong in the same ethnic group have a common genealogy or an ancestry and are also united by common cultural, behavioral, linguistic, or religious practices. The Mandalorians kind of only check half of those boxes when it comes to traditional ethnicity. Mandalorians share a language and culture, but not necessarily common genealogy or ancestry. While there are people who are born into Mandalorian culture and can trace their roots back to many generations within their own Mandalorian clan, many Mandalorians also join the group or are adopted. This means a Twi'lek can be a Mandalorian and so could a Corellian. Now, there are other ethnic groups that work differently, like the Jews, who aren't necessarily defined by their ancestry, but more by their common religious and cultural practices. The Mandalorian culture, in many ways, is closer to this definition of ethnicity. So when Prime Minister Almec and other naysayers point out that Jango Fett is from Concord Dawn and not Mandalore, it's not really a valid argument for why he's not a Mandalorian. Plus, Concord Dawn is in the Mandalore system and has been considered a part of the Mandalorian Empire from time to time. A more valid argument would be Does Boba Fett speak Mando? Because if he doesn't, that's a clear example of him not embracing Mandalorian culture. In Legends, we also get more insight on Jango Fett's own background. He was basically a founding adopted after his parents were killed by the Death Watch organization. And before Jango Fett was betrayed by Death Watch and then sold to slavery, he clearly was an upstanding Mandalorian and held true to traditional Mandalorian values. At one point, Jango was even the leader of the true Mandalorians, who were widely respected as defenders of traditional Mandalorian culture. Even when Jango supposedly sells out by taking on the Clone Army contract, he still brought with him dozens of Mandalorian warriors and bounty hunters to help him train the new Clone Army. He also trained the Alpha Arc commandos personally in Mandalorian combat style. Whether he was able to ingrain the same type of values and cultural lessons into Boba Fett is a whole nother question, but you remember what Hondo Ohnaka said to a young Boba Fett during the Clone Wars.
It is the honorable thing to do. It's what your father would have wanted.
Clearly, at least some kind of honor or morality system has been passed down from father to son. Perhaps equally as important is the fact that Boba Fett was the first Mandalorian we see on screen in the original trilogy. Without him, there might have never been the Mandalorian race in the first place. I mean, George Lucas is famous for contradictions like this, where he underplays the importance of something and then later on retcons it or says something that doesn't really add up. And in Legends, Boba Fett actually gives up bounty hunting and becomes the Mandalore, aka leader of the Mandalorian people. So at least in that version of Star Wars lore, he clearly becomes Mandalorian. The point I hope you're beginning to see here is it doesn't really matter what George Lucas thinks, what Disney thinks, or what anyone thinks, because the interpretation of what a Mandalorian is a very personal one, and there's a lot of room for judgment and points of views. The definition of who and what a Mandalorian is changes throughout the course of history and depending on who you ask. But by some definitions of Mandalorian, you can even consider Maul as a Mandalorian after he killed Pre Vizsla in an honor duel. With cultures like the Mandalorian, you're always going to have confusion and disagreements about what exactly they stand for. Also, people clearly change, especially a guy like Boba, who had a near-death experience inside of a Sarlacc. It's also possible that now he's at the age where he'll want to trace his father's roots and learn more about him. And who's to say that he can't adopt more practices common in Mandalorian lore, including learning the language. That's basically what happens in Legends, and so far what we've seen is Disney's creators oftentimes lack good ideas, and they do lean heavily and borrow from Legends for good ideas and material. So who's to say that Boba Fett can become the Mandalore once again? Personally, I'm interested to see if someone will help Mandalore rise from the ashes and return it to its former glory. They clearly need a leader, and maybe that leader will just be Bo-Katan Kryze, who's had a checkered history herself. But it would also be interesting to see Boba Fett embrace Mandalorian values. So guys, let's do a vote in the comment section below. Let me know if you think Boba Fett is a Mandalorian, or if you don't. Support it with facts and kindness to your fellow man. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.